What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you my top 5 meta decks for the May 2018 format. We're in a bit of an odd situation here because the May 2018 ban list happened to drop in the middle of the month, and the list doesn't go into effect until basically the end of the month, but there's one set coming out after that, as well as several regionals, and not to mention YCS New Jersey taking place at the end of the month, but pretty much in the first weekend of June. So I wanted to make this video to give my insights as to what I think the best decks are going to be moving into this format, and you guys can leave what decks you think are going to excel down in the comments below. But this way we can kind of track to see what decks we think are going to do well, and that way when June rolls around, we do the meta analysis after YCS New Jersey, we can see how the meta has started to shape up. So before we get into that, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest patrons as always. So big shout outs today to Derpy McSquiggins, Kevin, as well as Robert for upping his pledge as well. You guys are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. Starting off with number 5, we have Goki. Now, Goki is one of the decks that has risen out of Flames of Destruction's release as one of a very just highly competitive deck and strategy that's been doing very well at the regional level. Goki's really interesting because it's a very strong heavy combo deck, and the Nightmares have essentially helped facilitate and have really given Goki kind of a purpose. I've always said that Goki's had difficulty because it's a very good deck that can spam link monsters, but it never really had good link monsters to spam. But the Nightmares really fixed that, and now you're seeing Goki players doing 2-card combos that fully extra link their opponent at a fairly consistent rate. And we've seen this deck taking multiple first and second place victories at regionals that are 8 and 9 rounds, and that's pretty formidable. Now, the reason I have Goki so low on the list is because the deck is very fragile, and I mean that because Goki is very reliant on its normal summon, and it's very vulnerable to some of its combos in particular places, and if a player is able to stop those combos at particular moments, then the Goki player is going to be left vulnerable and probably going to get OTK'd on their next turn. That's one of the reasons why I have it so low on the list. I definitely think it's a very strong contender, and now that Pendulum Magician and Draco have been addressed on the ban list, I think the deck is going to see much more popularity. However, I still think it's held back by the fact that it's a very fragile deck and has a lot of shortcomings when it goes second. The deck does not play very well through multiple negations, and it's something that you definitely have to keep in mind when considering any strategy, because that's kind of how Yu-Gi-Oh! Is nowadays. You're set up a board with somewhat of, anywhere from 1, 2, or 3 negations, and if your opponent really can't play through them all, well, you kind of just won the game. And even though Goki's good at establishing multiple negations, it has some difficulty on the other end. So that's why it's in the number 5 slot. Definitely still a formidable threat, but not one that I would consider to be, anything higher than number 5. Now this brings us on to number 4, which happens to be Trickstar. Now, I really gotta hand it to Trickstar. Trickstar had an absolutely incredible record from the previous format. It was basically the 3rd best deck in terms of representation of top cuts of YCS's, and that's really something you can't overlook. I mean, that's just really proven everyone wrong about the deck. Some people are still going to be in amazement that the deck is still able to perform at this level, and you have to realize, on the ban list, nothing got hit in Trickstar. If anything, the deck got better from Flames of Destruction because the Nightmares add even more flexibility to a card like Scapegoat that Trickstar pretty much runs in 3s all the time. But, I mean, Terraforming didn't get hit, Trickstar Reincarnation didn't get hit. There's so many cards that Trickstar plays that were just potential targets on the ban list, but it managed to get off with a pass, and I think that surprised a lot of people, but I still think the deck does have its weaknesses in that it has difficulty getting over some big monsters, but the deck is still fairly consistent and good at what it does. Trickstar is a deck, like I've said before, that has to mold itself to a particular meta, so I have it in the number 4 slot because I don't think Trickstar will ever be like the best deck in a given format, but because of the adaptability of a deck like this, I think it's always going to be hovering around around that tier 1.5-ish area, where once the meta becomes more defined, Trickstar can adapt and play cards that are really going to help counteract the meta strategies, and that's where a deck like Trickstar will really excel. We'll just have to wait and see. The deck's already still taken multiple first places at regionals, but we'll just have to see what happens. Now this moves us on to number 3, and for number 3, we've got Altergeist. Now, Altergeist is just pretty much the epitome of a control style deck. This deck pretty much just got absolutely incredibly stronger thanks to the fact that Masterpiece got banned on this list. Same thing with Trickstar. I mean, Masterpiece is one of those cards that was so oppressive that it made it very difficult for decks like Altergeist and Trickstar to perform at their best, because it was basically the worst matchup that these decks would have. But now that Draco is out of the forefront, decks like Altergeist and Trickstar are going to be able to perform at a much higher level. Altergeist is really cool because it's a going first deck because you're playing a ton of stun and just basically reactive cards like all your trap cards, but you also have really good potential going second because you're playing cards like Infinite Impermanent in tandem with cards like Altergeist Multifaker, which means you can have multiple negations on your opponent's turn 1, not counting any hand traps you might have drawn in your opening hand as well. So by being able to already get your engine going before your turn 1 even starts, I think that is just absolutely incredible. The reason I have Altergeist in the number 3 slot is because Altergeist has probably gotten the most top 8 just representation out of any other deck since Flames of Destruction's release, and that's something that's very admirable. And for especially a new deck, you really have to look at these things and see, well, if a deck is just performing that well right out of the gate, there must be something there. And now that its worst matchup is completely well, not completely gone, but for the most part, not really much of a worry, I think Altergeist is going to have the opportunity to really shine. We'll have to see, but I think there's a lot of potential. And this moves us on to number 2, and I might be a little bit biased here, but I have Spiral. Now, Spiral's really interesting. This is another deck similarly to Altergeist that pretty much had the most top 8 cut representation out of every other deck pretty much since Flames of Destruction's release. It also did very well at a lot of the nationals taking place in Central and South America as well as Europe. This deck's really interesting because it actually shares a lot of similarities to Goki, where there's a lot of 2-card combos. They go into a Link monster that kind of facilitates and gets all of their plays going. They end on just insanely crazy boards thanks to in part to the Nightmares that are basically unbreakable, and that's really good. But one aspect where Spirals really shine in comparison to something like Goki, which is why I have them higher on the list, is that Spirals are incredibly powerful going second and breaking opposing boards. Cards like Spiral Tough and Spiral Super Agent were basically made for going second and breaking opposing boards. These are tools that Goki does not necessarily have, and by doing so, you're able to pick apart your opponent's boards and then go into your double helix and go into your play before, compared to something like Goki, where you don't exactly have that luxury and you're kind of hoping Isolde will stick, otherwise your plays are going to be entirely crippled. Spiral isn't nearly as reliant on its normal summon as well, and because Spiral is so powerful at going second, that's why I value it a lot higher than something like Goki. It may not be as consistent as some of the other decks on here, but it's consistent enough that it's been able to do well in multiple regionals and multiple nationals, and I think its power basically outweighs the fact that it might be a little bit less consistent compared to some of the other decks on this list. You also have to realize that Spiral Sleeper is basically the new Masterpiece, and a lot of decks have a difficult time answering that, especially if it gets established going first. I mean, a card that can't be targeted or destroyed by card effects, can't be destroyed by battle, it gets to pop 2 cards a turn. I mean, that makes it really difficult for really any deck to deal with, and it's basically, like I said, the new Masterpiece. So the fact that the deck has good tools going first, good tools going second, and has a pseudo Masterpiece at its disposal, I think that's enough justification to see this deck in the number 2 slot. Now, before we get into the number one, I did have a few honorable mentions. First off is Invoked and Invoked Mech Knight. Now, Invoked Mech Knight had a very good track record last format as well. The thing is, though, the deck really is bad going first, and that's its biggest shortfall, and I don't know if that's something that can really be handled. Now, the nice thing is with the FTKs put in check, you don't have to worry about not opening a card to basically disrupt your opponent, otherwise you just flat out lose. But with all these other decks having much more control style elements now, I don't know if that's going to be enough for Invoked Mech Knight to really perform. I still think Invoked as an engine is something that could be experimented with, and I think there's going to be some Invoked variant that's going to come out of this format. I'm not sure if it's going to be Invoked Mech Knight, but we'll just have to wait and see. True Draco's another honorable mention. Even though Masterpiece is banned, shockingly, I still think this deck is very viable as a powerful stun deck. I mean, hell, the deck got Dynamite Knight back to 1 and Ignis back to 3. It didn't lose any of its consistency cards. It's able to produce big monsters. It's very good going first or second, because going first, it can hide behind floodgates, and going second, it can aggressively just push and destroy and pick apart your opponent's board with the spell and trap card effects when they hit the graveyard. While Draco is definitely crippled by Masterpiece getting banned, I don't think it's the end of the deck, and I definitely think going into a regional or a YCS, you're definitely going to see people trying to get there with True Draco Stun. And lastly, Pendulum Magician. I think Pendulum Magician, even though it got just murdered on this list with Astrograph getting banned, as well as Starving Venom, the Pendulum mechanic is really resilient. I mean, we've seen Pendulum Magician just kind of adapt from format to format. It lost Double Iris, it lost Joker, now Astrograph and Starving Venom, and the deck's still been able to be one of the top decks, and I think that really says something. The Pendulum mechanic is very abusable, and while the deck may not be able to just FTK or just do the crazy boards it was able to before, it's still able to establish multiple negates. Now, it might require more specific combo pieces, or it might be less consistent now that you don't have your free Astrograph, cycling with Electromite. I still think people are going to try to find a way to make the deck work, so definitely do not count that out. So that brings us to our number one deck of the May 2018 format, and that deck is Sky Striker, Sentoki, Brandish, Strike Blade, whatever the hell you want to call it. This deck is going to be number one. Now, this deck is not going to be released until the 25th of May, if my memory serves correct, in Dark Saviors, but as soon as it's released, it's going to most likely be the best deck, if not one of the best decks of the current format. I want you guys to think back to Zodiac format, because there's a lot of comparisons here between Strike Blade and Zodiac. Now, the thing is, I'm not just strictly talking about one card XZ compared to one card Link. Obviously, that's a thing. What I'm talking about here is the fact that this was a control resource-based deck that also had a lot of aggressive elements. Think back to Zodiac when it was the Kaiju Zodiac variant that had Interrupted Kaiju Slumber plus a Rapier, any way to access Rapier, basically equaled an OTK. That was really nice, and in comparison, this deck doesn't have that because we don't have cards like Crystron Needle Fighter or Summon Sorceress that really enable an OTK with High Speed Roy Chumbara, and that's kind of what gives the deck a lot of its aggression. However, if within Zodiac you did not open that combo, you just out-resourced your opponent, and that's ultimately how you won the game. And Sky Strikers probably have some of the most crazy resource advantage gaining cards I've ever seen in this game's history. And not to mention, they are extremely generic. So not only are you going to see pure builds of Sky Striker running around, you're going to see people playing Sky Striker cards in pretty much every deck I mentioned on this list, and more. And that's another parallel because with Zodiac, you were either playing pure Zodiac or you were playing a deck that also incorporated Zodiac cards. Now, obviously the deck doesn't have its own Trident, but the cards that the deck does have are just ridiculous, and basically the deck is just going to be able to out-resource you, and that's ultimately how it wins. We're going to have to see what people come up with because our formats are completely different compared to the OCG, but that doesn't take away from the fact that I still think Sky Striker will be the best deck of this format. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about your thoughts on the top 5 decks moving into this format. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.